Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John Wickoffers has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on US-China relations. The first part, which is this one, will deal with how that relationship, the commercial geoeconomic dimension of it, as well as the geopolitical, which involves, of course, diplomacy and the use of the military exercises, so forth, export of weapons to Taiwan, strengthening the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and US, those four countries, in a containment attempt against China. All of this impacts the entire world. One of the reasons that the US-China relationship is so important, let me get this out front here, is that these two countries, which are the world's largest economies, we're not going to quibble about the PPP, whether the Chinese economy is larger, which it is, by the way, in purchasing power parity by 7 trillion in comparison with the US. However, the US economy is larger in nominal value, but not for long, maybe 5 to 10 years, according to the IMF and other organizations. That's about as much as the US will hold on to nominal value, number one status, and then China will overtake in nominal value as well. Be that as it may, right now, these two countries combined have 43% of the world GDP. They are just under 2 billion people. The planet has 8 billion people. 43% of the world's GDP is roughly 40 trillion. This is an enormous amount of capital of GDP to be held by two countries. Therefore, whatever they do impacts the rest of the world. So what I want to do in this first session, and then the second one, I'll just deal with China and the US in the bilateral relationship. This one, I'm going to branch out and take a look at, have a global perspective on this one, although it's unavoidable to have a global perspective on the bilateral relationship as well, because both of these countries are inexorably linked to the entire world economy, given the nature of the capitalist system. Capitalism is by nature an integrative system. It always was and it remains. Now, what is the source of the US-China confrontation, the conflict in the domain of commerce trade that has really caused a ripple effect across the world economy, considering that 43% of the world GDP is held by these two countries, and considering that China is the world's number one trading partner. According to the US Government Accountability Office, there are 5 reasons. They list 5 reasons. Number one, they argue China is responsible for an illicit movement, trade that is of goods coming into the United States. Okay. Is China the only one, and is it the most responsible one for the illicit drug trade on a world scale? Absolutely not. Latin America and Africa are also there. Other Asian countries like Afghanistan, with the considerable opium trade, is also there. But the U.S. uses this issue because the fact is that Mexico is used as a transit point to move illicit drugs up to the U.S. market. So that's one point. The second point that the U.S. Government Accountability Office lists is, well, China uses forced labor. Again, is China the only one? And is forced labor not benefiting foreign corporations doing business in China? Okay, what about the chocolate industry in West Africa, especially the Ivory Coast, and the mining industry in the Congo? They use child labor and forced labor. Well, okay, Western companies benefit from that. So the issue is not forced labor across the board, universally across the board, but just on China. So this issue is used as a pretext as well. Technology theft. China doesn't call it technology theft. The fact is they have deals with companies going in. They operate in China for so many years, and then there has to be technology transfer. Is there technology theft? Absolutely. Industrial espionage is an old business. The U.S. itself engaged in industrial espionage since the 19th century. So this is also a pretext because countries all over the world are engaged in technology theft. The fourth issue is China is strengthening its military sector, its defense sector, and catching up with the United States. That's true as well. However, the ultimate goal of China is global economic integration. It's not to replace the United States as the number one military power in the world. The U.S. spends roughly spends more, close to $1 trillion in defense, which is more than the next 10 to 11 countries combined. What it's doing in defense, it is modernizing its defense sector, everything from Navy to Air Force, in response to what it perceives as a threat from the United States in South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, because it sees the U.S. Agitating in Taiwan and imposing a containment policy, in part through the Quad group. Again, Australia, India, Japan, US, of course, those four countries, the Quad, but also plans to expand NATO eastward from Ukraine to the Black Sea, Transcaucasus region, Central Asia, to contain China and expand NATO as a means of containment of both Russia and China. So China is responding to military threats. China spends less than a third of what the U.S. spends, less than a third of what the U.S. spends on defense. Now, the next issue, the final one, is Chinese students in the United States. Chinese students in the United States make up roughly 25 to 35% of the total student body in higher education. And while the U.S. acknowledges they make a contribution to the U.S. economy, some of them do go back and do take back some of the knowledge, the expertise, and the U.S. regards this as a threat as well. The fact is, all students do that, all foreign students do that, but China is singled out. So what is the issue here? The issue here is very simple. The U.S. is continuously slipping in the global economic status rankings, and China is replacing it. China is the world's economic powerhouse by any metric, by the way, any metric. Like I said, even if you want to discount the purchasing power parity GDP, which makes China number one in GDP in the world, even if you don't want to take that into account, in a few years, China will surpass the US in nominal value. And this is the issue here. All of the confrontation here, however, between the U.S. and China, has a destabilizing effect on the rest of the world, and this is a fact that even recently at the Davos meeting in Switzerland, one of the IMF representatives pointed out. She pointed out that what we have here is that the United States approach to the issue of U.S.-China confrontation is, in fact, chaotic. It's risky for the rest of the world, not just in terms of U.S.-China relations, not just in terms of what impact it could have in lowering global GDP growth, if all of the threats are implemented, which they're not. We're going to get into that a little bit. But all the warnings and the bluster and the threats and so forth, the theater basically from the Trump group, which is made up of individuals who thrive on populist rhetoric, all of this has a destabilizing effect on global markets, including the New York Stock Exchange. And Trump himself, according to all reports, is concerned about this. So this is not helpful. Now, what is exactly the reason for the confrontational policy, the bluster, the threats, the mythology? Well, part of it is the overall ideology of a far right-wing administration in Washington, D.C. now, the next 4 years under this president, which appeals to a populist base, and they're using this issue to distract from the class war that is at the heart of the capitalist system under the neoliberal model. Class warfare has never stopped from Reagan, who implemented the neoliberal model, to the present, by the way, regardless of whether it was a Democrat or Republican president in the White House. The neoliberal model, which means deregulation, which leads toward monopoly capitalism and massive capital concentration for the richest 1%, deregulation, privatization. Trump is already given orders to dump more assets, public assets, to give them, we'll see what they sell for, probably pennies on the dollar, to billionaires, okay? Corporate welfare, which is an essential part of neoliberalism, by the way, okay? Attack on the trade unions, collective bargaining, and rights of labor, and also social justice and environmental justice. These are all part of the neoliberal model. And it isn't just the United States, it's a global model, by the way. China is not exactly following this model because China has a program to promote social development along with economic development. The United States does not. Most of the Western countries do not. China is also following a green economy model. Now, there are those in the West who argue, of course, they are following a green economy model. They're way ahead in solar panel development and electric vehicles, which they are, and they control the raw materials for the new energy, for renewable energy. That's true also. However, there is a core issue here. And the core issue, is there a way to manage the relationship? And is China at all at fault? Is it just the West, the US, and its trading partners, the G7, that are complaining? China does bear responsibility. We have about $105 trillion world economy, world GDP. China is realizing a trade surplus of $1 trillion, which is roughly just under 1% of world GDP. This is an enormous amount of money. There are 127 countries, that, including the United States, by the way, which suffer a trade deficit to China. This is not a way to go forward. You can't have one country realizing 1 trillion, close to 1% of world GDP, okay, at the expense for a sustained period of time, any sustained period of time, and this has been going on for a long time. For a long time, this is detrimental to the equilibrium of trade on a world scale. Now, through the United States, issue is that Pax Americana is over, okay? And Pax Sinica, the rise of China, in other words, is on the ascendancy. That's the issue. However, the fact is that China has to do some self-reflection. Is it in its own interest, in the interest of its long-term benefit, to pursue these kinds of trade surpluses? You can't possibly be doing this and have 127 countries suffer a trade deficit of 3% or higher, by the way. In the world, there are about 190 or 95 countries in the world. And to have that many countries suffer a trade deficit is not sustainable. So there is something to be said about the responsibility that China has now that it is in that role as the world's #1 economy, at least in purchasing power parity, and it holds such dominance in the economy of the rest of the world. Just as there's something to be said about the rather chaotic and reckless policies, which the IMF is absolutely correct on this, that the US is pursuing to counter all of this with threats, not just to China, but anyone that China is trading with, anyone, in fact, the entire world. So you have these approaches which the rest of the world has to suffer because of these two countries, which account for 43% of world GDP. Now, the United States, when Trump was sworn in at the inaugural ceremony, he argued that the golden age of America begins today. Actually, the Gilded Age of America has started when Ronald Reagan ushered in neoliberalism, and Trump is simply inherited the Gilded Age, and he wants to revive the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age, by the way, just for the record, was from the 1870s to the early 1900s, about 1900 or so, when the progressive movement started. The Gilded Age was really it's also called the age of imperialism and the age of materialism and the age of cartels and monopolies. This was the age when large cartels and monopolies basically enjoyed political control, enjoyed control over the courts, enjoyed institutional control. And democracy was really a facade and nothing more. This is one of the reasons that Biden, going out the door of the White House, stated in his farewell address, what we have here in the United States is an oligarchy threatening democracy. The question is, of course, to what degree did he and his fellow Democrats, mainstream Democrats, contributed to the strengthening of the oligarchy? That is the question. It is not just Trump. Trump is maybe used as a pretext. Trump is the extreme. He has gone to the far right, but he had a lot of help. He had a lot of help from mainstream Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans. He had a lot of help from Democrats, mainstream Democrats, all along, from Bill Clinton to Joe Biden. So when he said we're ushering in a golden age, he was reverting back to the 19th century, the late 19th century, monopoly capitalism, the era of cartels and imperialism. And he also made a reference, by the way, in that speech of manifest destiny, right? Manifest destiny and U.S. exceptionalism. All of this to make people feel good and to point out that the U.S. will become number one, make America great again, the MAGA slogan, and America first. All of this nationalistic rhetoric is designed to make people feel good, while capital is concentrated among the wealthiest in the country, okay? While the working class and the middle class is declining in living standards because of three major areas which Trump never addressed, as Senator Bernie Sanders correctly pointed out in his inaugural address, and that is education, the cost of higher education, which has skyrocketed, and it's the only vehicle for upward mobility. It's not China's fault that the cost of higher education in the United States is the way it is, by the way. China is responsible for that $1 trillion surplus, yes, trade surplus. It is responsible for that. It hasn't managed that well. And we'll talk about how managing this relationship between the US and China can actually benefit the entire world, including both of these countries. But China is not responsible for the cost of US higher education. The US is. US policy is. Then we have cost of housing. China is not responsible for the cost of US housing, rentals and mortgages. US is not responsible for that. China is not responsible for that. The US is. And then, of course, there is the dreaded healthcare. US has the highest healthcare costs in the developed world. Nobody's responsible for that except the US. The policies of the US designed to have the people at the bottom pay, okay, or excluded if they can afford it. That's public policy of the United States. It has nothing to do with China. And using Chinese tariffs, the bluster of 60%, which now seems to have settled at 10%, all of that is distraction. That's all it is. It's distraction from the plight of the working class and the middle class, which, again, Senator Sanders was right. They were not mentioned in Trump's speech. He mentioned manifest destiny, exceptionalism, the golden age, all of this to support the billionaires surrounding him at that inaugural celebration, right? So this is part of the issue. The question is, of course, let's assume, let's take facts. Let's assume that tariffs, as Trump and his officials keep saying, will rise. And the tariffs will benefit the American people, although they're a burden to the American consumer. But let's assume That's not the case. If we consider the revenue of tariffs from the mid-1950s, from the Eisenhower administration to the present, the gross percent, the total percent that tariffs bring to the US budget is 2%. 2%. They bring roughly 80 billion. What's 80 billion going to do? The US is a $28 trillion economy. Even if they were to raise the 2% to 3%, what would that do to the US economy, which has serious structural problems? On top of that, the destabilizing effect, and this is where the IMF came in, is that this administration wants to broaden this out to hit India, Canada, Mexico, the European Union, Japan, everybody, basically everybody, the world, US against the world. This is why I believe that the management of the US-China relationship, and by the way, just for the record, China has toned down some of its rhetoric, which was on the side of defensive before Trump took over, and has now stated, let's sit down, let's manage this relationship for our mutual benefit and for the benefit of managing the world economy. Because the largest countries in the world, these two, have a responsibility to the rest of the planet, 8 billion people. Whatever they do impacts the rest of the planet. I want to point out that the United States reference to Canada and to Mexico and to the Panama Canal. And again, I'm going to try to be as balanced on this as possible, is aimed at China. And to some degree, it is a reference back to what Trump stated in the inaugural address about the 19th century, the manifest destiny. And he pointed out, he mentioned McKinley's name, President William McKinley's name, and so forth. And it is a way of arguing that the Western Hemisphere belongs to the United States, that the United States will remain hegemonic in the Western Hemisphere, which is a long-standing policy of the United States going back to President James Monroe in 1823 when he promulgated the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine stated that the Western Hemisphere belongs to the Americas and that extracontinental powers must stay out. That this and the United States, presumably, although in 1823 the US hardly had the military means to keep anybody out, that the United States was the keeper of the Western Hemisphere. Trump basically wants to consolidate here in the Western Hemisphere. Just as China, by the way, in this respect, it makes geopolitical and geoeconomic sense, I suppose, if you look at it from a strategy point of view. Just as China's goal was immediately to consolidate in Asia and Eurasia, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative program, the massive infrastructure and development program that China promulgated about 10 years ago. So the Trump administration is saying, okay, now let's remember, this is our hemisphere. If we want to buy Greenland, annex Canada, take back the Panama Canal, and bully around Mexico, and into submission, we can do that. We can revert to the Monroe Doctrine, which gives us that kind of authority. Well, this is the 21st century, by the way, and the world is much more integrated than it was during the Monroe Doctrine and throughout the 19th century. This is not how things are done. This is, again, I'm going to reference the IMF. This is why the IMF was so alarmed by what this man is saying. This is not the way to manage global trade policy. The way to manage global trade policy is to sit down, exactly as Beijing, as President Xi Jinping pointed out, is to sit down and, okay, let's find out where we can agree and where we can't, and see where we can reduce some of our interests. Now, I should tell you, by the way, when Trump left, when Trump was in the White House the first time, in 2018, in fact, the U.S. China trade was at 25%. Now it's reduced to 18%. The U.S. has reduced its reliance on the U.S. market by 7%. It's turned to other places, from Indonesia to Kazakhstan. A lot of it, by the way, in Asia and Eurasia, some of it in Latin America, places like Brazil, also Mexico, by the way. Now, it is also true, and this is where the United States, whether it's Biden or Trump, doesn't matter, they all agree on this, by the way. It is also true that China is using circuitous routes to bypass U.S. The wrath of the U.S. on China trade policy. It uses third countries to, in this case, Mexico directly. It sells to Mexico. Mexico sells to the U.S. Therefore, Trump, who obviously has advisors who have informed him of that, said, "Well, let's hit Mexico and any product coming in from China through Mexico." So this is the highly integrative nature of the trade policy of today's trade policy, and why managing it is far more advantageous to all parties concerned than pursuing tariffs, which yield very little, as I pointed out, 2% since Eisenhower. Okay, 2%, that's it. It's nothing. And then the consumer hurts because, let me explain something that what happens when countries impose tariffs. This happened in the United States. What happens when it happened in the United States from the 70s onwards, when the U.S. started imposing tariffs on Japanese autos, what happened is the U.S. automakers raised their prices on their own cars and lowered the quality. So the consumer suffers, by the way. They pay higher price because of tariffs on foreign cars, and the quality goes down. Okay, so this is not advantageous to the consumer, the U.S. consumer. Okay, now there is the other issue of expanding China's the war with China, the trade war with China, to include, of course, Europe, and to include India. The United States has no qualms about placing tariffs on Europe, as well as India, as well as any country that the U.S. deems is engaged in unfair trade. Now, there is a term called dumping in economics, which means that a country is selling its surplus at lower prices, often subsidized, and that is at the disadvantage to domestic companies. For example, let's take steel. If a country overproduces steel, and its government can subsidize it often and sell it at a lower price to a country willing to buy it, and that will undermine the domestic steel producer, let's say in the United States. So the United States has, in fact, complained about a number of countries, including European Union countries, of um, taking advantage, as Trump puts it, taking advantage of the American market, which is free and open. By the way, it is not as free and open as Trump makes it out to be. Trump, however, is using his own tactics to impose conditions on the European Union. Number one, they must, he stated very clearly, buy more oil and natural gas. The Ukraine war, the proxy war up there in Ukraine, Russia did invade Ukraine, there's no doubt about it. That could have been solved diplomatically, but it was not. The US wanted, since Obama, to have the United States natural gas companies and oil companies sell energy to the Europeans. They were opposed to Russia selling natural gas and oil to Europe. They wanted to diminish it, to lower it to the lowest degree possible. Okay. Trump now comes along and explicitly states you must buy more oil and natural gas from us. The Ukraine war was about that in large measure, in addition to US pushing NATO expansion eastward from the Black Sea through the Transcaucasus region, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and then Kazakhstan, Central Asia, to contain China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. That's part of it. But it was about natural gas and oil. And now Trump comes along and explicitly states, yes, we want you to buy more gas and oil, although they pay a lot more for it than they were buying Russian oil and natural gas. That is undeniable. One of the reasons that the European Union economy has had the problems that it has had since the start of the Ukraine war is precisely because of that, and the sanctions that the US-led group, G7 and allies, imposed on Russia, which helped the United States companies, energy, especially energy companies. Biden did more for those energy companies than Trump, who claims to be more pro-fossil fuel friendly. Actually, Biden did more for them by not negotiating a diplomatic solution in Ukraine. So now Trump is coming along and saying, okay, you don't want us to be punitive toward you with regard to tariffs, buy more natural gas and oil. On top of that, buy more defense material. More defense contracts. He wants them to raise NATO defense spending to 5% of GDP. Now, some countries may be able to afford that. The Europeans have already stated that the European Union countries, with the exception of course, Britain is no longer in the European Union, but the European Union, continental Europe, generally is not as pro-defense and pro-defense spending as the United States. The United States has a history of being pro-military, pro-defense. Okay, it has a long-standing history. The European Union does not. The European Union had a history of being more friendly toward social safety net programs, taking some money that would have been spent on defense, spending it on social safety net programs, social welfare programs. Now Trump comes along and says, almost double. It's 3% theoretically, by the way. They don't spend 3%. They spend a little bit lower than that. So theoretically, double the percentage spent on defense and buy from American defense, from the American defense industry. So the pressure of the U.S. on Europe is at the economic level using tariffs, just as it is using tariffs against China. So the Chinese model is universally applied by the United States. This is very important because even India, which actually is part of the Quad, along with Japan, Australia, and the United States, these four countries, and tends to be more pro-US in countering the rapid rise of China geopolitically, although it's part of BRICS, the BRICS group. Even India is targeted by the Trump administration when it comes to tariffs. So the China model is universally applied. And this has sent shockwaves for the IMF, which, by the way, the IMF headquarters is just down the street from the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, next to the World Bank. Historically pro-US, as pro-US as you can get, pro-Wall Street. And yet they come out and they warn about what the US is about to do. Not much about China, just what the US is about to do. Because the IMF knows China is willing to sit down and negotiate. Not just because China says it, because it is shown with its actions that it is willing to sit down. When Xi Jinping sent its vice premier to Trump's inauguration address, by the way, I just want to point this out as an aside. It's interesting that he didn't go to the politicians, the political group. He went to Elon Musk and to the billionaires, and he talked to them directly about trying to do something about regarding Trump's and the political class in the U.S. confrontational trade policy toward China and the world, which impacts the world in any case. Because China, remember, is the world's #1 trading partner. So it impacts the entire world. That's what this is about. It is about the future world trade. So the vice premier of China goes to Musk and he goes to the billionaires and he says to them, look, you have all made money, and it's no secret. American corporations, multinational corporations, have made trillions in the last 40 years doing business in China. That's no secret. And they continue making a lot of money, huge profits. So he went to them because the Chinese know where power rests. It rests exactly where President Joe Biden reminded the American people going out the door of the White House, the oligarchy. So the Chinese went to the oligarchy. They didn't go to Trump. And they said to the oligarchy, put some pressure on your representative, the person representing you, your interests, so that we don't have any accidents, any risks to the world economy. Now, I want to point out that the Trump administration is really fighting an uphill battle because, as reports have come out recently, the president himself has an eye on Wall Street, and he is jittery. He's concerned about how Wall Street responds to his tariff policy on China and the world, because the China, and apply to the entire world. The Make America Great Again and America First logo is now a universal logo. It's US against the world. But he is concerned because he knows the US does not have that kind of muscle, economic muscle, to pull this through. Now, the US does have the military muscle. And here's another dimension. To what degree does the US pursue the geopolitical angle as leverage in the domain of geoeconomics? Use the Navy, use the Air Force, agitate in Taiwan, agitate in the Philippines, in the South China Sea, agitate with a Quad group, agitate with NATO, try to expand NATO again. To what degree and what are the risks to the entire world? Again, this is not just about the US or China. It's about the world. Whatever they do, it impacts the world. And that is what is at issue. I want to end this session with a report that Oxfam out of England just published in January 2025. They pointed out that in 2024, billionaires in the world increased their wealth from 13 to 15 trillion dollars. That is what is at issue, because what we have is the richest 1% on this planet owning almost half of the world's wealth. 1% owning almost half of the world's wealth, while 8 billion people own the other half. That is the issue, not economic nationalism that Trump is pursuing and trying to universalize it and distract his own people, his own citizens, the American citizens, as well as the world, as though this is the issue. This is not the issue. Corporations are going to continue to make money. They're going to circumvent and make deals. Warren Buffett ignores whatever Trump is doing. When he's asked about, you feel safe about investing in China, he laughs it off. I have no problem. I invest in China. I make money in China. This is how absurd this is. This is about concentration of wealth. And this issue is a distraction. The issues that are of importance are living standards for the world's population, including, by the way, the American working class and the middle class, which he didn't mention. Bernie Sanders was right. There was nothing about them, about cost of housing, cost of healthcare, drug prices in the United States, highest in the world, higher education, a vehicle to upward mobility, nothing. All there was is the Golden Age, the Gilded Age, which, by the way, when you scratch the surface of that Gilded Age, you find nothing but decadence and rottenness behind it. A corrupt system that erupted in the progressive movement. Those of you who know American history, the last quarter of the 19th century was a very decadent period of racism, massive concentration of wealth, anti-labor, business attitudes, anti-trade union, anti-women, anti-minority, anti-migrant. This is a reversal to the late 19th century. The late 19th century was nothing to be proud about. This is not a model for the early 21st century, neither for the US nor for the world. So the question is, going back to Xi Jinping's statement, is how can we manage the US-China relationship so that we have mutual benefit? This is not to say, by the way, I want to again stress this, because it seems that I'm just focusing on the US side, that China has no responsibility. China has enormous responsibility. China is the world's largest economy. In purchasing power parity, it's around 37.5 trillion, something to that effect. The US is 28 trillion. China is the world's largest economy. It has 1 trillion, or roughly 1%, of world GDP in surplus. That's absurd. It should place limits on itself. It should not permit itself to do that, to have that kind of, it undermines the rest of the world like this. It should want to have trading partners that are sound and solid and sustainable, just like the United States during the Truman. Let me just say this as an aside, since I'm a historian. When Truman took over after FDR died, he realized that it wasn't in the U.S. interest for the U.S. to be in such an unprecedented economic hegemony status in the world in 1945. He realized that very quickly, because Europe was destroyed, Japan was destroyed, China was in a revolution under Mao Zedong and Chou Enlai. So he figured that we have to do something. That is when loans began and grants and the Marshall Plan ultimately, and there was a Marshall Plan equivalent for China. And then, of course, the US propped up South Korea and Taiwan to strengthen trading partners so that it have some strong trading partners to trade with. Because who would it trade with? The US discovered this back in the 1940s under Truman. China needs to discover this today. So this is not just the US responsibility. China has an enormous responsibility. It's so euphoric about its Belt and Road Initiative program. And yes, we eradicated extreme poverty, while the US has a rising poverty and rising in economic inequality. That's all true, by the way. But China has responsibility. Now, the US, for its part, of course, needs a rational approach to this. It does not need to place itself, China, and the world at risk by pursuing policies that are to no one's benefit and will simply bring world GDP down, exactly as the IMF is warning, by the way. These policies, although they constitute the receipts, that is the duties that the Customs House collects, are minuscule, it disrupts trade on a world scale, it raises prices, it lowers consumer demand, okay? It causes rising unemployment. All of these are disruptive measures. Now, in the next session, I'm going to deal with a bilateral relationship. I want to thank you for listening. I want to ask you to write comments, ask questions, and by all means, join this educational channel. It's managed by my very good friend Asad Alim, and I thank you again for listening.